It Came from the Closet is a collection of 25 essays on queerness and horror. I read it on my phone, which is why I'm holding my phone. I'm going to put it down now. It Came from the Closet was edited by Joe Vallese, and it features multiple queer writers discussing the queerness within horror films, all the way through the last 50 plus years of horror. Most of the essays focus on one specific film that the writer wants to hone in on and discuss. I read this collection out of order, focusing on the ones that I was most interested in, then the ones I was less interested in, and finally the ones that were about films that I hadn't seen at all. There's a really good range of old versus new films being explored here, so you've got old blockbusters like Jaws and Godzilla, classic cult 80s films like Friday the 13th, Halloween, and The Exorcist, and then more modern horror films like Hereditary and Us, as well as one really great essay on Jennifer's Body, one of my favourite films. Most of the essays are particularly personal. They explore the writer's relationship to that film, and we get a nice bit of backstory about them and what their connection to the film is, why that film speaks to them so well, why it caters to their specific experiences, and they see so much of themselves in it. This is something that I can sometimes relate to as a reader and sometimes can't, and it'll be the same for you. And this is also kind of a double-edged sword. Sometimes the personal tone of the essays feels like a little bit too much. What I expected going into this was going to be multiple discussions from multiple perspectives on the queer nature of horror itself, which is something I think about a lot. But it isn't really. Sometimes that happens, and it's really, really satisfying, and I came away with some really fun new perspectives to mull over and consider. Other times, it was just too personal. It was just a personal narrative. Here's something that happened to me when I was a kid. This was my queer awakening. This was something that I did as a teenager. And this is a horror film that I watched that I related to for some reason. And that's kind of it. So in that way, some of them seem a little bit too shallow. Some personal narratives that didn't really get my brain ticking over in any way. And I really wanted that, because I love the relationship between queerness and horror. It is something that I'm truly obsessed with. Since coming out as non-binary and then trans, I found that I was falling deeper and deeper into a rabbit hole of horror the more I understood my genderqueer identity. And I found that there was a wonderful parallel between me going on this transgender journey and me engaging more and more with more and more horror. This was a parallel journey I was going on, and so I became obsessed with this interesting interconnectedness between horror and queerness. And so when I was sent a copy of It Came from the Closet, I was overwhelmed with excitement. I wanted to read multiple queer perspectives on horror, and I do get that here. You will get it if you read it, but not quite in the way that I was expecting. Sometimes, yes. For example, this collection is separated into 5 parts of 5 essays each. And in part 1, which is called An Excellent Day for an Exorcism, which I think is kind of a Castlevania reference, you've got essays on The Exorcist, Jennifer's Body, Hereditary, and The Ring/Pet Sematary. And I loved all of these essays. Absolutely loved them. And after reading them and finishing part 1, I was so excited to dive in further and further. But after part 1, the essays ebb and flow a bit too much. From really exciting explorations of the core concept of horror and its relationship to queer identity, to here's my personal story, I hope you care about it, which I often didn't. And the whole collection ends on an essay about Sleepaway Camp, which is a cult slasher film from the 80s. Now, I love Sleepaway Camp. It's a very, very interesting film about transness. And that transness is very briefly mentioned in this essay, but the essay is mostly about the writer being gay. But it's the transness of Sleepaway Camp that makes it such an interesting film, and I was so excited to read this essay for that reason, and it's not what I got. Not only that, but it does say that this is the writer's second time writing a specific essay about Sleepaway Camp. And I'm like, okay, so you're a queer expert on this film at this point. Where's the meaty transness of it? What I love so much about Sleepaway Camp is the fact that our protagonist, and I'm going to spoil the ending, at the end turns out to be a boy. All the way through you think that this protagonist, who turns out to be the killer, is a girl, and then it turns out that he is in fact a boy. And at first you think, wow, this is kind of a transphobic story, but no. It's kind of subversive by accident, because this protagonist has been dressed up and forced to pretend to be a girl after he lost his family and was forced to live with an aunt who always wanted a daughter, dressed him up as a girl called Angela, and had Angela go off to this summer camp and be Angela for the entire film. And then at the end, it turns out that he is in fact a boy called Peter, who we thought died at the beginning of the film. Peter was never Angela. Peter was forced to socially pretend to be and identify as a girl, but all along he was a boy. In many ways, this is a very interesting, if very dated, exploration of transness, and it's entirely by accident because it wasn't the filmmaker's intention to do any of this. And I found Sleepaway Camp very exciting for that reason, and none of that is explored in this essay, and I was just very disappointed. And I think a lot about the relationship between transness, queerness in general, and horror. As I said, I have become increasingly obsessed with horror, especially body horror. The most obvious explanation of the relationship between queerness and horror is fear. Fear of the other, fear of the unknown, fear of things that are unnatural. White Western conservative Christian society fighting back against the weird, the strange, the queer, the unnatural, right? And we relate to that. We relate to being othered. We relate to being treated as monsters, treated as unnatural. We relate to Frankenstein's monster. And this is why vampires are so damn gay. Horror is also incredibly fantastical and camp and theatrical. Forms of art and media that are often related to the queer experience are things like drag, cabaret, theatre and musicals. They are all performative, they are all extravagant, they are all camp and colourful, and provocative sometimes. Horror is all of those things, which is why the Rocky Horror Picture Show is one of the greatest stories ever told. Rocky Horror is all of this stuff smushed together. It is a musical, it is camp, it is explicitly queer, and it is horror-inspired and horror-themed. And horror does what musicals and theatre do. It is about costumes, it is about camp, it is about extravagance and being silly, being over the top. But it's punk and exciting and strange and scary and monstrous, and I identify with all that stuff. I love all that stuff. But everything I'm saying here hasn't really been explored by this essay collection. Not to the point that I was kind of hoping. All of that said, I very, very much enjoy the individual essays and what they had to offer. I just kind of wanted more of a general exploration of the relationship between queerness and horror. But the essay on Jennifer's Body, the one on Hereditary, the one on Godzilla is really good. The one on Godzilla, I won't spoil, I won't talk about that one at all. I found that one particularly engaging. The essays that I read that were on films that I haven't seen made me want to watch those films, and gave me a kind of insight into those films that I'll be able to take with me as I watch them for the first time, and that's really exciting. But because I love the relationship between queerness and horror as a concept, as a theme, as a philosophy, I wanted more of it on a broader scale, but what I got instead were very specific, very narrow and focused readings that revealed something specific about the person that was writing the essay. And that in itself is great. It takes a lot of courage, and it makes you see that film in a completely new light, and it shows how films can unexpectedly relate to us and our experiences, especially when they were not intended that way at all by the creators. It's the beauty of interpretation, it's the beauty of art as a mirror being held up to us, as a window into other worlds, as so many things. It's beautiful. It shows the importance of art and our relationship to it as individuals and as a collective, and as a small group within a collective. So I'm quite divided on this essay collection. In some ways, it's everything that I hoped it would be, expected it to be, and wanted it to be. And in other ways, it just didn't explore horror and queerness on a grand scale in the way that I had hoped. But I am still so glad that so many queer writers, creators, thinkers, journalists, etc. are all considering that exciting relationship between queerness and horror. It's beautiful, it's wonderful, it's exciting, and I agree with it, and I feel it in my bones. I love horror, and I find myself loving horror increasingly more and more with each passing day. I live and breathe horror films, horror video games, horror novels, comic books. I listen to nothing but death metal and black metal. Horror means so much to me, and this essay collection made me feel a kinship, made me feel a connection with these writers, and that's a beautiful, wonderful, exciting thing. I'm very glad that It Came From the Closet exists. It didn't always give me what I wanted, what I hoped for, what I expected, maybe even what I needed. But it also did, because what I also needed was connection and understanding and a relationship with other queer lovers of horror and people who find a connection to horror through their queerness. I got all of that. So in that way it surprised me, and it was a welcome surprise. As you can tell, I am divided. I loved this book while also being disappointed by it, and I wholly recommend it because I need to know what your experience and your connection to the book will be. So please check out It Came From the Closet, especially if you're a horror fan, a queer person, or both. Especially both. Subscribe for books.